So when we talk about our games, we always say they're a reaction to the previous game, you know, and when I described how we started Pyre, it's no way we make that game without having made Transistor.
How would you explain it?
Oregon Trail meets NBA Jam.
The gap between us completing work on Bastion and starting work on Transistor was like many, many months. We took a long break. Whereas after Transistor was done, we were starting talk about our next game very, very soon after. So we were really eager to just sort of palate cleanse and get started on something new. And it was really hard to gain momentum early on Transistor because it was so easy to shoot ideas down because they wouldn't, for one reason or another. Whereas with Pyre, the mindset was more of like, everyone go free, do your thing. With Pyre, we were interested in like the idea of a game with a bigger cast of characters, sort of like if we were to make a bigger like party-based RPG, genre that many of us really love, what would that look like? We had made this very kind of lonesome world in Transistor and Bastion for that matter, and like let's make a game that has more warmth to it with like a bigger cast of characters that you get to know.
So there was a lot of heaviness in that project and a lot of like small groups, so we wanted to like bust it open. We wanted to have a big cast of characters, and that meant we needed gameplay that was multi-character, and we're gonna take this whole other gameplay challenge on, and we're gonna have an overmap, and then we're gonna have all this narrative, and it's gonna be like our big expansive RPG. It's gonna be like our PC RPG with you know, where you put together a party, some of the feeling of some of the games that we used to love, like JRPGs and stuff like that, but mix that in with like really fast-paced, real-time stuff, and you know, let's do something interesting with player failure. Let's let you lose every single right and still have that be supported narratively.
We were interested in doing in some ways a more kind of straight ahead fantasy setting where, you know, from Jen's standpoint, being able to create characters of all different shapes and sizes, whereas in Transistor, you know, everyone is kind of like a strapping human-looking character. It's like, oh man, let's just go wild and have, you know, tree people and undersea people and all kinds of like wild fantasy stuff. Let's just do it.
Our initial, as I recall, our initial hope was that we could just finally create like a high fantasy game. We were like, we want to draw elves and dwarves and we want druids. Like we want just all like, we just want to do like straight like D&D, Magic the Gathering, like this is straight ahead like high fantasy, which I love. And I was all for. And it's funny because it like, you know, I think Amir very consistently did have this like, let's do this like team-based something where like you just experience something as a big team. And in trying to support that, I think we ended up going to some weird places.
During Pyre, we kind of like, something clicked and we became, I guess, much more professional. I think that's when the sort of forced vacation days was implemented. So yeah, I think everyone was just kind of in a better place. And thankfully Transistor was successful enough early on because of course, you know, we self-published it, so there wasn't a publisher cut being taken. It was a higher priced game than Bastion, so it simply, financially speaking, we just make so much more per copy of Transistor sold than we do Bastion. And what that meant was that for game number 3, Pyre, we could get really, really weird, which it certainly is, and it's why it's my favorite.
We started with a completely procedural world and procedurally generated characters, and then we narrowed that into something that felt more familiar and that we could execute better. We really hesitated to use some of the terms that people now freely use with Pyre. Like I don't think, for example, you can go on the Steam store page and find the word sport anywhere.
You know, we never said it was a sports game. In fact, we were pretty concerned with people calling it that. But the sports influence is clearly there and does run very, very deep in the game.
Yeah, so we knew we were going to have this kind of like 3-on-3 like combat, like adversarial competitive combat situation. And I was at the Chieftain where Greg told me what he thought might make a lot of sense for that, which is, you know what is kind of like competition and kind of like sports and kind of like all that stuff is a ritual, which has like prescribed rules and usually has someone who presides over it and all these types of things. And that's where the kind of like black magic vibe of Pyre comes from.
And one of my early conversations with Amir about it, Amir kind of recounting this experience of, in like kind of like an American football context, the idea of having your like star player carrying the team, right? And to victory after victory. And then one day the player retires and you bid farewell and the player's in the Hall of Fame and all this kind of stuff, but there's a bittersweetness there, right? Because that player is no longer there to carry your team. And this sense of like the experience of retirement was very interesting to us. And that like really translated into like a specific thing we were going for with Pyre, which was like, can we have this group of characters that you grow attached to such that when you are presented with a situation to say goodbye to one of them, can it matter to you? And moreover, can it have some of that complexity of the sports analogy of like, I need this guy. This guy's carrying my team, so I really don't want you to retire, but also I want you to be happy. And having to like struggle with that as a player, I was very, very interested in seeing if we could achieve that. The problem is, in order to prototype what I just described, you have to like make a whole story and have all these characters and actually do all the stuff to make a player grow to like them and grow attached to them. Then have the part where you have the opportunity to give one of them up and have that feel meaningful and have all the presentation that requires. And even after that, you have to keep going and have the part where you experience sort of the loss of that character and you look around the room and you're like, man, that was Hedwin's cooking set. He's not here or whatever. So it was not something that could be rapidly prototyped. We had to build a whole bunch of stuff before we could get to a point where there was any evidence at all that we would be able to sort of like achieve this sort of tonal thematic moment that at least to me was like it was the part of Pyre that I was interested in chiefly.
So where did the idea of the orb and the goals, what are they called again?
The Pyres.
Of course.
The Pyres, Danny. The original name for Pyre, of course, was goals, but we decided to not go with that. Yeah, I mean, we were, I think as part of it is like we were interested in this sort of competitive ritual, which ended up having a lot of sport-like qualities, So it ended up having this like 3-on-3 vibe where you're passing the orb around and you're trying to basically dunk the orb in the opposing Pyre. That's something that we just sort of built slowly over time. We knew we wanted a competitive experience. And part of the reason we wanted a competitive experience like that is because we wanted high intensity combat that it was okay to lose. So that meant people can't just be like dying as a result of you prevailing and like the door being shut on ever seeing them again. We wanted a game where you could learn from your failure, learn from a loss and keep going. We wanted a game where you would have to confront the idea of a setback with your little team, with your little crew. We wanted all the ideas that come out of being able to only field 3 of your exiles, right? Like someone wanted to play and didn't get to, and only your highest level exiles actually get to go and achieve freedom. So that means who you play really matters, and the decisions you make as you go really matter.
Freedom! Dare you tamper with forbidden knowledge? So soon after your sentence into exile. 'Tis true what the book says. You can be free again. Perhaps not you yourself, but someone worthy of the privilege.
You know, it was a really interesting process for Pyre because we didn't have anything that we were really basing the combat on whatsoever. It was kind of just like thinking of like, part of it was just kind of like what was what felt good to move around, switch between characters. We had a lot of different ideas of course, the part where you can only control one character at a time is a very core aspect of the game.
I really enjoyed the gameplay a ton because it's NBA Jam has like a special place in my heart, and that game spiritually I think has a lot of NBA Jam in it, the essence of Jam. And it really took a lot of restraint for us not to record the Archjustice saying boom shakalaka. It really did.
The auras in Pyre had a lot of inspiration from kind of like territory control, whether that was from like a game like Civ or SRPGs or something where you're kind of trying to like control territory and block certain routes and stuff. We talked a lot about like how flexible or how rigid the auras were supposed to be, and what different like shapes they could take that might be fun.
Sinners, remember everything which you hold dear.
The AI in Pyre was the whole, that's definitely a much more complex system than just, an individual, enemy in Bastion or Transistor. It has to, come up with a whole game plan, and we want them to kind of like embody these personalities while still like, playing an effective game, and you feeling like, oh, when you play each team, they have their different personalities you interact with before and after, but during the match, are they all just kind of doing the same thing and trying to make them like not feel robotic?
Those were some of the struggles that we had, trying to make everything, again, just fit together, trying to find the correct proportion of story to rights gameplay, like making it so that when you get to one of these mystical competitions that that it feel like the stakes are high. So building the stakes up to that, but not building them up so much that you feel absolutely horrible if you don't succeed in one, and not just kind of bogging the pace down too much. And we also took on some things that were really challenging, such as like the game not having a game over state. So me having to write like a plausible scenario for the player who literally fails every single step of the way, and having that make any kind of sense, having it be believable that the characters would not abandon you and that sort of thing.
We bit off a lot in Pyre, which was really exciting at the time. Saying we wanted a bigger cast than we'd ever shipped before, and we wanted a bigger world than we'd ever made before. Like, we committed ourselves to something a lot bigger than I think we even knew we were getting into. And so those kind of creative problems of like how to deal with a new camera angle are really interesting to solve, but in the heat of trying to ship a video game, there were moments for sure where I was like, why didn't we stick to isometric? I knew isometric. I guess when you change too many of the ingredients at once, it can be a little overwhelming, and I definitely felt that on Pyre. We're happy with what we came out with, but if you ask me if I wouldn't mind spending another like 2 years fleshing out that world, absolutely I would love to.
Pyre was a different beast because now I was playing 5 characters. I play the only like English-speaking character, which is the Archjustice, the pompous voice you hear presiding over the rites. And then I play a bunch of various triumvirate members. I play Dalbert, I am Ignarius, I am Lendl, and I am Bertrude.
The rules of the rites were not created for you to besmirch. Prepare now to confront the fate.
The Archjustice is interesting because it was my first time with a Supergiant game playing a character who's really not your friend, and yet still trying to make him at least enjoyable, if not, maybe not likable, but just, you hopefully look forward to hearing from him whenever you start a new rite.
Cholarescu Noxalas.
Dalbert was probably my favorite, just this like wizened, old, kindly dog, which was great. I remember having to do research on like what an elderly dog barks or growls sounds like. Bertrude is like a bog witch, and my first time playing a woman character, which is cool.
Yeah, the voiceover for that game was a trick indeed, because it's Greg, made up a language essentially, and at first we tried some scratch where the characters would read a direct translation of the actual line, and it ended up being super long and weird, and like someone just keeps talking after you're done reading the thing, and so we ended up going with like a quip style thing. So we recorded essentially like hundreds of different quips. We recorded and kept 5 takes minimum for each of those. And we kept those in for Greg to have options when hooking up the voiceover to the different lines.
I just had to follow Greg's pronunciation guide as best I could. We all did. I think there's about a dozen actors in Pyre, and we all just sort of had to like tune up. It has very kind of like Spanish and Greek influences, and if you do it enough, you can kind of you can see it. You can see it in the line. Like, okay, it's going to sound like this.
Recording it, I would say, was okay. Wasn't an insane process, but what Greg went through hooking everything up, I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy.
Each of our games, we've invested a lot into the endings. Just try to, for players who stick with us until the end, we want to make sure that you leave our games feeling good and glad that you invested the time. And each of our games has had like a different sort of model for the ending. So in Bastion, you're presented with these choices. In Transistor, there is no choice at the ending because it's really about Red's decision and not yours. But in Pyre, we wanted to do what Amir and I would call the Fallout ending, just having like a sweeping epilogue of like how you affected the lives of everyone around you and the places you've been and so on. So all of the decisions you've made consciously and sometimes subconsciously throughout the game, they would you just have this sweeping epilogue of like what happens to every single character.
And there's so many little things that it feeds back on, and then it puts together a song based on what happened in your game. Oh my God!
Their journey began on a barren waste where the reader arrived, afraid and alone. When he arrived, the book of rights awakened the night wings and ignited the flame.
Because we had bards, and the idea was like the bards are sort of describing your epic deeds, right? That was like, I knew I wanted that to happen early on, and we prototyped a thing where we could have reactive vocals that would sing something different based on choices you made or something you did. And so we ended up with this song that has different vocal versions depending on which gender choice you made, like at the beginning of the game, and what happened to each of the individual characters. Either they ascended or they did not ascend, essentially, was how we broke it down. Because if we made it less binary than that, there would have been like thousands. I mean, so just as it was, there were 6 different vocal tracks, and we had it automated to like pick, if they made this choice, pick marker A, at marker A, pick track 1, and at marker B, pick track 2,
Joe Dariel, mother to many a foundling.
That was nuts, and that was really satisfying to be able to do, just because really early in the project, I knew I wanted to do a reactive song, and I'm glad I got to do it, even if it was just at the end credits. Oh, that and Never to Return, I guess, are both pretty high concept in that we have Never to Return has 9 versions of it. Depending on which triumvirate you face in the final rite, the Ascension rite, a different version of that piece will play, reflecting the other team that you are facing. So the music is different and the lyrics are different depending on which triumvirate you're facing in that match. So that's crazy. I had to make 9 versions of that song.
It's not for me to say if it's my best work, although I personally think it contains a lot of it. That's for others to decide. But for sure, it is my most work from like a word count standpoint. There is a lot of story content in Pyre. I am so grateful to fans of that game who really connected with the various characters in the story. The characters of that story are very, very dear to me as well. And the story of that game is in fact like heavily inspired just by my own experience of working at Supergiant and like finding my place among a group of people and coming to grips with myself and what I'm good at and what I'm not so good at. That makes it sound personal, but it's also just something that I felt like players of the game would be able to connect with. And it's a game about how small, seemingly small actions, you know, this act of almost like a sports-like competition can have bigger significance, and about a group of characters who finally, you know, come together to make a bigger difference.
Without Pyre, you would not be playing Hades. That's right. It took what Pyre was to drive the types of evolution we went through as a studio after Pyre to then make Hades. Like, I love Pyre because it helped us understand kind of what it would be like to run a little bit freer on a game, to feel less constrained and less pressured by some of the constraints that we had on our previous projects. It was creatively incredibly exciting to work on and to collaborate on. It felt really, really good to get the game out there and to have people who really, really got it. And to have people be able to spend at what was at that point the longest amount of time they could possibly spend in a Supergiant world, and to share their endings and to talk about the decisions they made and, you know, the incredible amount of cosplay that comes from having 20 characters or whatever in your game.
It's just such its own thing. It's such a weird and odd little duck, but I love that game to pieces.
If we don't make this, no one else is going to make this. And that's something I do look for in the games I work on here. They should, if nothing else, add something positive out there. It may not be for everyone, and that's totally fine. It's actually better for them to not be for everyone because they can be more specific and mean more to the people they are for. But that feeling of like, we've brought something unique into existence, and if we wouldn't have done it, nobody else would have. That's to me, it's a motivating feeling. The magic of our games, if it exists, comes from the creative conflict. It comes from the synthesis of ideas. None of the games we make here, I think, would be made by any individual here, if that makes sense. Like, if I could make whatever game I wanted, just translate my own thoughts into a game, I wouldn't have personally necessarily made any of the stuff we made here. I'd make other stuff. But the games we've ended up making, they're like even better than those games because they contain a bunch of ideas that I wouldn't have thought of that are brilliant. And then I feed off of those ideas and do my thing and so on. So it's this weird like symbiotic process that's just made possible because of the group of individuals that we have here. And over time, it's just become clearer to us that we not only is our whole team is just kind of configured around the idiosyncrasies of the individuals that are here. We rely heavily on voiceover because we know Logan and he's a genius actor. Gen Z, I think, is one of the best artists working in the industry and stuff like that. It's just like we have very kind of music forward games because we work with Darren Korb. He's a genius composer.
I get to work with some of my best friends in the world. I get to work with some of the most talented people I've ever met. I get to do it in a way where I basically have sort of free creative reign over the music and audio for this stuff, and get to express myself creatively in a few different avenues. It's really, yeah, I mean, I can't really imagine, yeah, like a more sort of perfect situation for me creatively. It really is a delight.
I just love the freedom we have here to kind of like make our own games on our own terms. The fact that every time we make a new game, we just sit down and, you know, talk through what everybody's interested in.
Yeah, I think one of the missions of the company is to make these games that mean a lot to ourselves, but also we've been able to do it in a sustainable way. You know, it's been 10 years, we're all still here. We were working in Bastion, we were younger and working out of a house. It was easily 15-hour days, and there's no one, I don't think anyone could do that for 10 years. A lot of people here have families now, and you know, it's really cool to just sort of see our lives and the studio kind of grow up in parallel together.
So when we talk about our games, we always say they're a reaction to the previous game, you know, and when I described how we started Pyre, it's no way we make that game without having made Transistor and reacting to the game that Transistor was and how it felt to work on Transistor. And so, you know, with Pyre, I think, God, it was really nice to try to make something kind of big feeling. And I am really, really glad I got to have that creative experience, and I got to have it kind of safely with people I love collaborating with.
Gira! Carritos. Karate. Huh?